We'll read together now verses from Hebrews chapter 7, 8 and 9. So I'll start at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 26, and read through to verse 6 to chapter 8. Then we'll go over into chapter 9 and read a couple of portions there. So Hebrews 7, 26. This is the living word of the living God. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men in all their weakness, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son, who has been made perfect forever. Now the main point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest, who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, "See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain." But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Then turn over to Hebrews chapter 9, and we'll read the first 14 verses and then verse 22 to 28. Hebrews 9, verse 1. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up in its first room with a lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshipper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands, that is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, so obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. And down to verse 22. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands. It was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Amen, and may God bless to us the reading of his word.
Let's pray together as we come to the word of God. Lord, we praise you that you are high, indeed on the highest place, on the throne of heaven, and we thank you, though, that you stoop and speak to us who are on the earth. We ask now that from heaven you might send your Spirit to lift our eyes to your Son, that we might know him, we might see him, that we might love him. Lord, refresh our hearts through your word and stir us up to love and good deeds, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, do keep your finger sort of there in chapters 7, 8, and 9. We will be moving back and forth between those two chapters, particularly of chapter 8 and chapter 9. I wonder if you've ever heard of a piece of graffiti. I've got to be careful about my plurals and singulars here, haven't I? A piece of graffiti, that's okay, called the Alexamenos graffito, singular. Apparently there is a singular of graffiti. The Alexamenos graffito. We don't know exactly when it's from, possibly from the 200s, possibly from the 300s AD. Something that was scratched by someone to make fun of this guy Alexamenos on a plaster wall in Rome, so probably around the 200s or the 300s, but was covered up and not found again until about 1856. And when they found this picture, quite amazing, it's probably one of the earliest pieces of art to do with Christians, though it's probably in mockery of Christians. And it's a picture of this chap called Alexamenos, and we know what his name is because it's underneath the picture, with his hand upraised towards a figure who is on a cross. And the figure on the cross has unusually the head of a donkey. And Christians were sometimes mocked that they worshipped a donkey in sort of early post-apostolic times. I couldn't quite work out exactly why, but it might be that idea of worshipping one who bears our burdens. But here was someone mocking this guy, Alexamenos, and written underneath is the sort of subtitle, Alexamenos worships his God. Worshipping this figure on the cross. Now, it was meant, obviously, to mock some guy who was probably a Christian. And yet, for all its mockery, it actually gets the Christian faith just right, doesn't it? What is it that's at the center of the Christian faith? Who is it that we worship? Jesus Christ and him crucified, as Paul says. He's meant to mock Alexamenos. In one sense, it's a wonderful picture. Here's Alexamenos worshipping his God. Yes, Jesus, the one who died. The cross is at the center of the Christian faith. And as we look at these two chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews, and we're going to be spending the next 2 weeks, we're going to see that this idea of the death of Jesus, this reality of the death of Jesus, is at the heart of what the pastor, the writer to the Hebrews, has to talk about here. His main aim is really the aim he's had for the whole letter, and you can kind of see it if you back up right to the beginning of the passage we read and look at chapter 7, verse 26, and chapter 8, verse 1. So he wants to convince them, as he's been doing for the whole letter, I don't want you to move away from your Christian hope, brothers and sisters. And so in 726, he says something like this. Do you know, this is the kind of high priest we really need. One who's holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners. And 8 verse 1, and indeed, the main thing I'm trying to get at, isn't that helpful when a communicator says this? This is the main point. I've been talking for some time. This is the main thing I'm trying to get at, 8:1. We've got that kind of high priest in Jesus Christ. He's trying to convince them you don't need to move somewhere else because, yes, there is something you need. There is a high priest you need, but you've got that high priest if you've got Jesus Christ. And particularly as he unpacks how we have the high priest we need in Jesus in 8 and 9, he moves to this idea of Jesus' death. And to explain the significance of Jesus' death, what he's really going to explain is you don't need to go back to those old things of the old covenant because they pointed to what you really need. The sacrificial system pointed to what you really need, and the old covenant under Moses pointed to something else that you really need. And both of them come together and are fulfilled in the death of Jesus. Now, those two themes of covenant and sacrifice and how they come together in the death of Jesus are woven together in chapters 8 and 9. And what I've done is slightly picked apart the theme of sacrifice that we'll look at this week. And next week we'll come back and look at covenant. And thankfully, as I looked through it, it is actually possible to do that. We didn't have to pick words and verses apart too much. But there are chunks. I encourage you to go and read the whole of chapters 8 and 9. You can see these chunks of covenant and sacrifice. He moves back and forward. But we're just going to look at that idea of Old Testament sacrifice. How does the sacrificial system of the Old Testament point us to how Jesus is really the high priest that we need, and particularly the significance of his death? Now, as he explores that here, he goes after two slightly different things. The sacrifices themselves, what was offered by the priests in the Old Testament, but also where they were offered in the tent, in the tabernacle, where they were presented. And we're really going to work through those two things. What was offered, how it points to Christ, and then the tent and how it's a pointer to Christ. So first, the sacrifices themselves, the Old Testament sacrifices, as pointers to the significance of the death of Jesus. You see, he's been saying that Jesus is a high priest. And he reminds us that if Jesus is a high priest, well, he's a priest. And what do priests do? Have a look down with me at chapter 8, verse 3. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. That's a good high priestly job description you might find in the newspaper. One wanted, need to be appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. And so if Jesus is a high priest, it was necessary for also this one, that is Christ, also to have something to offer. If he's a priest, he's got to make an offering. He's got to have something to offer. Think of it, that reality was part of the pattern of Israel's life in the Old Testament. Daily offering of all kinds of different kinds of sacrifices, blood sacrifices, burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, daily, day after day. And also yearly. He mentions here that special Day of Atonement sacrifice, where the priests would go in once a year, every year, and offer a particular sacrifice. In that sense, if you read through books of the Bible like Leviticus, there is that sense that they are very bloody books, filled with blood, filled with animals being slaughtered and killed, bulls slaughtered, goats slaughtered, heifers burnt. And God had not just commanded this, but he'd explained why this idea of blood was so significant. In fact, in the context we're going to read, he's talking about how you need to be careful about blood. You need to not mess around with blood, or drink blood, or eat blood. No, blood is special of these animals. Why? Well, if there's a verse that I remember penciling in my Bible somewhere in the New Testament as a reference, probably a couple of years into being a Christian, someone mentioned it and I wrote it down. Leviticus 17:11. For the life of a creature, the Lord says to his people, is in its blood, and I have given it to you. That's why I've given it to you, something special, to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. That is to reconcile you to God, to bring you back to God. It is the blood that makes atonement, that is, that reconciles for your lives, he says. Now, the pastor here is going to go on and say how that wasn't ultimate. That was just a picture. It wasn't really the blood of bulls and goats that made atonement, that took away sin. But even as he says it's a picture, just because it's not ultimate, doesn't mean it isn't good. It was commanded by God. Well, why? Why would God set up a picture all about this bloodiness, this slaughter of animals to make atonement? Well, I think there's a couple of things that picture teaches us as we really get to grips with it in the Old Testament. He alludes to those things here. It teaches, as we think about it, that God is a God who demands justice. He wants satisfaction against sin. You see, all the sacrifices most of them were connected to sin. They put at the heart of Israel's life a central truth that if there is sin, sin has to be paid for. That, in fact, sin ultimately has to be paid for, not just in some way, but paid for with life. Sin can only be paid for, in effect, with capital punishment, the giving of a life. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life, Leviticus says. God wanted a picture at the heart of Israel's history that said, when there is sin, it must be paid for by someone. I demand satisfaction. Justice must be done, says God, in that whole system. Now, perhaps you're quite used to that reality and you see the goodness of it, but all of us might not. Some of us might react to that and say, does that make God sort of less than me? Or less than other people? I mean, after all, when we experience sin committed against us, don't we just forgive? Isn't that the noble thing to do? We don't ask for retribution and satisfaction and punishment, do we? We forgive. We let those things go. So is God then perhaps less than us in some way because he demands satisfaction for sin, that sin be paid for? Well, I think that's probably not really a fair objection if we realize that, of course, we and God have different roles in the world. We're creatures. He's the creator. We are morally responsible agents, yes, but God is the judge of all. You and I are not responsible in the way that a judge is. Think of it. There's some significance, isn't there, if someone does something against you amongst your family or in church and you forgive them and you let it go. That's a good thing. It's a noble thing. But would we want to apply that to a higher level in some ways? Would we want to go to say to the chief court judge in New Zealand and say, as people come before you who are pronounced guilty, you ought to say, I pardon you in the name of New Zealand? That would be something profoundly wrong about that, wouldn't there? Even if we might forgive someone who'd sinned against us in breaking the law, yet we see that it's good for there to be forgiveness. And yet also there's a desire that somehow justice be served. Even if we know that probably we're not the ones individually to serve it, yet surely somewhere in the economy of the universe, justice needs to be done. It's not okay just to say it's fine and to sweep sin under the carpet. And indeed, the Lord doesn't do that. The Lord demands satisfaction. The Lord wants to set things straight, but in setting things straight, it means punishment, justice. And as we'll see in a minute, that doesn't mean that at a small and wonderful level, God in regards to us doesn't say, I don't demand satisfaction. You see, actually, in a small way, in a way considered just between us and us as his people and God, God actually is indeed a model for how we're to behave. He draws us to himself and says, I'm not demanding satisfaction with you. I'm forgiving. And yet that's only because, as we'll see, justice comes somewhere else. Satisfaction is moved from us. The book of Hebrews teaches the same thing that Old Testament picture teaches. You can see it there in chapter 9, verse 22. It reinforces this sense that God's justice must be satisfied, and without some satisfaction there can be no forgiveness. Verse 22 of chapter 9. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. He's going to say that's exactly right. Just as it was under that picture, so it is in reality. Satisfaction must come somewhere, and it must be by the shedding of blood. So that whole pattern of Old Testament sacrifice taught about God's justice, but it also wonderfully taught about God's mercy. You see, in showing that someone has to pay, at the same time, it taught, didn't it, that payment could be experienced in someone else, in something else. Satisfaction was demanded, but not on the head of the Israelites, but on the head of animals. Someone else's blood could be spilt for you, the blood of a goat, the blood of a bull. And so in that Old Testament sacrificial picture, there is both justice and mercy. I wonder how many Israelites, as they remembered what Moses was told at Sinai, wondered about it and then thought about the sacrificial system. How do you fit those things together, Lord, that you said about yourself? The Lord, gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving iniquity, and yet he doesn't leave sin unpunished. How can that be, Lord? He punishes the children and children and grandchildren to the third generation. How can it be, Lord, that you punish and yet you forgive? I wonder if they wondered about the sacrifices. Oh, here in these goats is satisfaction and justice. And yet, it's not falling on me. And yet, though it was a great picture, the pastor is saying here, it wasn't the full reality. As he'll go on to say in chapter 10, the blood of bulls and goats can't really pay for sin. I wonder as well whether pious saints in the Old Testament looked at it and said, this is good, but I don't think this is quite all. I mean, after all, I, a human, have sinned. My life must be taken. And indeed, in the sacrifices, a life is being taken, but it's not quite a human life, is it? And the pastor says, indeed, it was only a picture, a good picture of justice and mercy brought together, but only a picture pointing somewhere else. He shows some of the weaknesses as he describes it here. He says it can't be the real thing because the priests who offered the sacrifices were themselves sinful. He says it can't be the real thing because they did it day after day, year after year. It kept having to be done because it didn't really do what it pointed to. If it had, it would have been finished. If it had, it would have been done and dusted and needing to be done no longer. It didn't really achieve what it pictured. And if we've been reading the book of Hebrews this far, we know why. We know that the one who dies for our sin, as Jesus was, had to be made like us in every way. God is just. He requires payment, but not just payment, payment in kind. Human life for human life. And so his son came, fitted as the second person to human life, that he might trade his life for ours, that he might pay justly exactly what we owed, and that we might get mercy. All of this justice and mercy brought together, pictured in those Old Testament sacrifices, the pastor says, it's not about them, but it points forward to Jesus, who died like a lamb to the slaughter for us. Where does he take it, though, in application? I meant to say that we'll keep coming back actually to one little section here that it's good to keep your finger on, verses 11 to 14 of chapter 9. We'll come here a few times. Because in a way, I think he brings together a lot of the themes and application in these verses. But before we go there, in thinking about what he says, I want to sort of give you an image. I wonder how many of you are familiar with the play Macbeth. I don't think I've ever read it or studied it or seen it, but growing up in England, I'm probably the same in New Zealand, there's little bits of it in the culture. There's sort of Shakespearean phrases in the water. And so perhaps when they talk about someone who is racked with guilt, someone might talk about or refer to Lady Macbeth. Have you ever heard that kind of referral? Now, I had to go and look up and just confirm so I get all this right, just in case there are Shakespeare buffs here with us. Lady Macbeth is married to the protagonist Macbeth. And she effectively, she hears that Macbeth has himself received a prophecy from the witches that he'll become king. And so she wants to orchestrate that he will become king. The one who's the king at the time is Duncan, and so she goads her husband on to kill the king. Macbeth kills Duncan. But then, being the smart lady that she is, smart, cunning perhaps, she decides, well, we must make sure that we're not gotten for the murder of the king so that you can become king. So she frames Duncan's servants. She takes the dagger, now covered in blood, and plants it with the servants who they drugged to fall asleep. Macbeth has killed Duncan. Lady Macbeth has framed others. They're both covered in blood. And so they leave the stage to go in to wash their hands and wash their clothes. Lady Macbeth is then absent from the play for several acts. And when she comes back, it's a very strange scene of a doctor and someone else that they're talking to, talking about the troubles of Lady Macbeth. And this servant says, yes, I see her rise nightly. She walks in her sleep. And as she walks, she wrings her hands as if she's trying to wash them. And she mutters these kinds of things, and these are the famous parts. Out, damn spot, she says. Oh, will these hands never be clean? This is Lady Macbeth as she's half asleep. Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. You see, she's washed away the blood, and yet she knows that there's somehow a spot that still remains. She's got something that can clean, but it can't get actually where the stain really is. And so her conscience is stained. You You see, actually, that weakness of water and soap for Lady Macbeth is the same kind of weakness that the pastor says was there in the Old Testament sacrificial system. A good picture, but as an effective means to get rid of sin, it couldn't do it. 9 verse 10. They, the Old Testament sacrifices, are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external things. They only wash the body. If sin were dirt, they'd work. But the stain of sin is somewhere else. But the blood of Christ. Verse 13, you see, if the blood of goats and bulls then, he's arguing from the lesser to the greater, if the blood of goats and bulls can bring some kind of cleanness, an outward one, how much more then, verse 14, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God. He's saying the blood of Jesus gets to the conscience. I think he's using it here not so much as a subjective feeling guilty, but as if the conscience is a place where guilt is stored. And just like soap and water can get to the part that's dirty if it's outside, there is a part where guilt is stored, and he says the blood of Jesus reaches there, sprinkles there, cleanses there, makes holy there. You see, I imagine for all of us, there are things here tonight that can't be seen on our body, necessarily seen in our faces. But things, if we turn inwardly and think, we see that spot of sin. Perhaps even as we heard from Peter this morning, things that stain our conscience objectively, but we're not even aware of. And yet, whether they're things that plague our conscience subjectively, or mar us before the living God to stand before him, the blood of Jesus, the pastor says, can cleanse those things. It gets to those spots. It's like the ultimate spot remover. It's such a terrible imagery, but I'll give it to you anyway. It's not of enough worth. But I can't help but think when you use those kinds of stain removers with really stubborn stains, and they're called, aren't they, sort of spot removers, both because they remove a spot, but if you've used them, you have to put it right where it needs to go, don't you? And so you don't just chuck the t-shirt or whatever in the wash with the powder, but you put it on beforehand. You find the spot, you spray it on where it needs to go. And the pastor's saying, the blood of Christ goes right to that point of stain. Right to where it needs to go. Wherever there's guilt, wherever there's condemnation, wherever other things like the blood of bulls and goats couldn't cleanse, Christ's blood cleans. Now, there's one thing more to add here, because I think there's one other thing to take in the midst of life from this. If this is true, that all this system points to Jesus, and that his sin, that his death pays for our sin entirely, then it means one thing for when we suffer. It means more than one thing, but for when we suffer, it means at least this: that if Jesus once for all has paid for your sin, for my sin, as we suffer, whatever we experience in life, we can say to ourselves, whatever this is, whatever God is doing here, this is not me paying for my sin. Isn't there temptation as we face difficulty to think, here it is. I knew I felt guilty. I knew there was something, and here it is. Here's the Lord making me pay. But the pastor says no. Did you notice 3 times, in fact, I think 4, he says, Jesus once for all. Once he says once for all appeared, I think he's lumping the cross under that. 3 times says once for all died. In contrast to those animals that kept having to be offered again and again and again. Why? Because they didn't do it. Jesus has done it. Once for all. Jesus has paid for your sin, and so whatever happens to you, as a believer, you're not paying for your sin. You might be being sanctified. You might be being chastened. You might be being disciplined. You might be being instructed. You might, even with Job, say, I don't deserve this. It's a mystery. I don't see the purpose. It's not even chastening or instruction or discipline like that. But whatever it isn't punishment. Because Jesus once for all took your punishment for sin. So woven through these chapters then is this wonderful way in which he explains how the sacrificial system points to Jesus' death, showing us what we need, and then showing us the one who gives what we need. But there's one thing more, that it points here in the work of Christ to this idea of the tabernacle and how that was a sign pointing to Jesus. Notice through here how often he uses this kind of picture language. Did you notice that? It comes up several times. A copy, a picture, a shadow, a sketch, some translations have, and mostly about this idea of the tent. The tent, he says, the earthly tabernacle, where they offered the sacrifices, just like the sacrifices weren't the real thing. So Jesus, exalted, has gone into heaven, he says, the true tent. He's saying that Jesus in heaven now, in the presence of God, at God's right hand, is somehow in the ultimate, the true, the real tabernacle of God. Not an earthly thing made with fabric, but something not made with human hands in the heavens. Now, what does he mean when he says it's the true tabernacle? Is he saying that Moses' one was sort of somehow fake? Well, no. Look back at chapter 8. It wasn't that Moses' one was fake. It was commanded by God. It wasn't wrong. They serve, he says, the Levitical priests at a sanctuary, that is a tabernacle, a holy place, that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. Moses was commanded by God to make the tabernacle exactly as he did. So what does he mean that Jesus is now in the true tent? See, he's not saying that there was something wrong or bad about the Mosaic tabernacle, but it was just a picture. It was a copy. In the same way that perhaps when someone's an architect, again, a layman's position on architecture, but I think when people are architects, sometimes they don't just draw plans, but they might actually make a scale model to show someone. This is what it will look like in 3 dimensions. There's nothing fake, is there, about that model? You can't just build that model however you like, can you? It has to have the right proportions. As you're measuring it out to cut out the card, you can't just say, well, bit of a line here, bit of a line there, cut here, cut there, 14 at the top, 11.5 at the bottom. It doesn't matter. It's got to scale properly. It's got actually to be very precise. But it isn't the real thing, is it? The client doesn't take it home with them and try and move into it. It's true in the sense that it's a good copy, but it's not the real thing. Moses' tent was a good copy to show something of scale about people entering into the presence of God, and yet it was pointing to the real thing. That is the heavenly courtroom of God into which Jesus has gone. You see, think of it, he says, as a copy of the heavens. Turn over with me to chapter 9. You see, even as a copy, what is it that... I can't help but think, it's easy to think without comment, but we cannot discuss these things in detail now, that he's done the thing that preachers can do, is start down a road and then realise you're running out of time and sort of back away from it. But I think what he says about the details are actually significant. Let's think about how he describes that mere copy. Now, the first covenant, 9 verse 1, had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up. In its first room were the lampstand, the table, and the consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we can't keep going on like this in this much detail. But think of what he's talking about. If you'd been a priest, or even particularly the high priest, going in there. And even if we don't go back and read the passages from the Old Testament that have even more detail that he summarizes, what do we see here but all these different, strange, unearthly things covered with gold as you progress more and more into the center of things, shining light, lamps, reflected light, glory. And then you come into the most holy place. And there is the ark of God, in which are these otherworldly things of a staff that budded and tablets with God's signature on them. And over you stand two angels towering with wings spread out. I mean, how did they feel? Glory, awe, reverence, fear. And yet he says, oh, sorry, but it was just a copy, wasn't it? He describes it as glorious, fearful, awesome, and yet it's just a copy of where Jesus has gone, of the real presence. Because though awesome and glorious, as a picture of that awe and glory, it was also a picture of another truth. God's presence is awesome and glorious, and you can't come in. You and I can't come in. 9 verse 6. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But the real holy place, verse 7, that only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, one man once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and the sins of the people, which they committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this, that is, one man, only once a year, that the way into the most holy place, the real one, had not yet been made known. And so instead he directs our eyes to Jesus. Jesus who's gone into that holy place in heaven, the real holy place, and not just gone into the real holy place, but gone into that place as a forerunner, as one to make a way for us, as one to drag us along on his coattails. Back again to 9:11 to 14. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death? So what? So that we might become priests. Well, that's not quite how he puts it, is it? But it's what he's saying, I think. So that we might serve, as priests do, the living God. We'll come back to that in a moment. But just before we think about the application here, just one last thing, because I think it helps us. You see, it would have been a temptation for his hearers, I think, in considering going back to the Old Covenant to say, this business of Jesus being up in heaven is awfully disappointing. This Old Covenant stuff, we see at least most of it. We touch at least some of it. We know. It's full of robes and incense, things that one can taste and touch and smell. It's so real, isn't it? And yet now you tell us Jesus and he's up in heaven. We've never seen him. We don't know what he looks like. What's he doing there? I want something I can hang on to, say the Hebrew Christians in the difficulties of life. And Jesus is exalted and majestic and up there. And the old covenant's right here. And yet he's saying to them and to us, the fact that you can't see Jesus is the very point. You see, a priest, when he's doing what you really need, that is, he's gone into the Holy of Holies, can't be seen. And so Jesus being in heaven out of your sight is the best thing for you and I at the moment. Until he comes again to take us to be with him. He's there in the glory of God on our behalf, interceding for us. The reason we can't see him is because he's in the right place. I heard someone, I'd love to say this is my own illustration, but it's not, or my own recognition, talk about that anchor language just a chapter or two before, and say it's the same thing. If you can see your anchor, it's no good to you. You want to bury that anchor somewhere. You want to put it out of sight, down beneath ocean waves, if it's going to stabilize you. In the same way, Jesus, our high priest, has disappeared from our sight because he's the one we really need, and he's doing what we really need. So that what? So that we may serve the living God. So that we may serve the living God in the presence of God as priests, even now as Jesus is. You see, what he's alluding to here is that though that's where we're heading, though we're heading now and we can say to ourselves, where am I heading? Into the very presence of God, where Jesus already stands on my behalf. That even now, he says, we may serve like priests. We may worship in the presence of God even now. Some philosophers in arguing about how to view things use a Latin phrase called, and I'm going to butcher it, but sub specie aeternitatis. That means under the view of eternity, and they're normally using it to mean sort of in a slightly negative way, oh, what will really matter if you view things in the course of eternity? In some sense, even in that last phrase here of 14, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God in heaven. He's saying that to live the Christian life is to live, and I had to look up the declension to get it right, sub specie caelorum, under the view of heaven. You and I as Christians now already live a heavenly life. We live under the view of God. We live even now as priests in the presence of God. And so whatever we do, whatever you do this week, you can say as you do it, Jesus' death has cleansed my conscience. Jesus' death has cleansed my conscience from acts that lead to death, so that even now, in my business, in my family, in my car, I'm worshipping the true and living God in heaven. By Christ, and by the Spirit, I'm in his presence, before him, living to him, pleasing him. You see, in both these ways, in the sacrifices themselves, in the tent in which they're offered, he says the death of Jesus is where they find their fulfillment and their center. Jesus' death really is at the heart of our religion. His death that takes away acts that leads to death, and his life that leads us into a life of worship like Alexamenos, worshipping the one who's crucified, worshipping the God-man on the cross. Let's pray. Lord, we know that as Jesus spent time amongst his disciples, he frequently spoke of their slowness. And as the pastor speaks to these Hebrew Christians, he speaks of their slowness and their sluggishness. And so we thank you. We thank you that you speak in such extensive ways in the Old Testament and spell out pictures and types and symbols and signs and whole dramas that we might understand in our slowness what Jesus has done for us. And we ask, Lord, even this week as we sin, that we might remember that Jesus' death has satisfied your justice, taken away all the acts that lead to death. And so even now we stand sanctified to serve the living and true God. Lord, we ask as we face all the things that you bring to us this week, you might help us to lift our eyes to heaven and say, Lord, now for you. Lord, now we live for you, and we long for the day when Jesus will come again, not to pay for sin, but to save us who are waiting for him. We ask all these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.